Recording a lot of hips right now. Random. Yeah. I probably end it. Oh, I know what it is. It's kind of like my personal, so I have a. So I don't know if I caught your name. You are, oh, let me let you two first. I'm Darby. Nice to meet you, Darby. I'm Kendra. I'm with BioKansas. Yeah, I've heard your name. Yes. I'm one of 3 with BioKansas. So nice. I work in right level. Oh, very cool. Very cool. They're a great organization. I'm stuck there, so oh, can help them out with the red stuff. That's awesome.
Oh, that's pretty loud.
Do I need to turn it down?
So my name is Aaron. I'm part of the KC RiBS Executive Committee. For the people here today, over here at the order, stand up and say your name. I'll put you on the spot.
Hi, have a great day. Hi, I'm Larry.
We'll get spot. I'll get some more.
Okay, I'm ready.
I'm Lori. I'm Darby.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming. You can see that we've got a lot of people here. So big thanks to Alma Mader, and if we feel too crowded, you can meander back and forth between the bar and here. I want to give a big thanks to BioKansas, that's Kevin. He helped to provide financial support for the event. Supplied the beer, so big thank you to Kevin. Also, a big thanks to Missouri Cures. They helped co-sponsor the event, as well as KC RiBS and my fellow executive committee members to get this together. And again, big thanks to Alma Mader as well for but I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. In terms of format, both Dr. Thyfault and Dr. Carlson will speak probably about 5 to 7 minutes. And after John will go first, and after he's finished, we'll have a brief Q&A for a couple of questions, and then I'll introduce Dr. Carlson. He'll do the same 5 to 7 minutes. We'll have a Q&A, and we'll have a broad Q&A, but with some great discussion. Without further ado, I wanted to introduce Dr. Thyfault. He is a professor of cell biology and physiology at the University of Kansas.
Hey, John.
And Dr. Thyfault,
When you go up, can you ask if the Zoom people can hear? Thank you.
Physiology, investigating health physical activity, and aerobic capacity, mitigate obesity, metabolic diseases, and aging and translational animal research. So without further ado, I will hand it over to him.
Hello everyone. Can people on Zoom hear us? Give us a thumbs up or something. Can you tell?
Yeah,
All
we're
right.
good.
All right. Well, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here. This is a challenge for me to not have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll go through this the best I can. Okay. So I've been studying exercise and metabolism for around 25 years now, and I've given a talk like this a lot about the power of physical activity and exercise. So today when I say physical activity, I'm talking more like ambulatory activity during your day, a lot of movement, a lot of steps. And when I talk about exercise, I mean program a movement, like you're gonna go for a 30-minute walk, or you're gonna lift weights, you're gonna play a sport. But there's a lot of overlap between those two, and Jordan will talk about that more, okay? And what I'm gonna relate this to is glucose metabolism. So one of the problems with doing exercise research is that most people in the United States, when they think of exercise, they think of obesity and body weight. And they think that when you exercise, your body weight should go down and you should become less obese, and that the cause of obesity is not exercising enough. And there is some relationship to movement and exercise and excess weight gain and all that. In truth, exercise isn't that effective at lowering an elevated body weight. You have to add some caloric restriction in there. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't exercise. And unfortunately, most people are reactive. Most people, they start to exercise, they start to be more active, they don't see their weight go down, they think they're getting no benefit, and they stop. We have to disassociate those things. When you move every day or you exercise, you're doing thousands of things to the cells throughout all of your body. All of your body. There's multiple pathways that are being activated in muscle, brain, liver, kidney. So in relation to glucose metabolism, every time you eat a meal, you eat a pretty healthy meal, food, but glucose goes up in your bloodstream, okay? It goes up. And your pancreas responds to that glucose by making a hormone called insulin. And insulin does a lot of different things, but in this context, what it does is it tells your body to take that glucose out of your bloodstream and get it disposed of in tissues. So it can either be stored or used later for energy, or used at the time for energy. And one of the biggest tissues that's important for getting rid of glucose out of your blood is the muscle, the skeletal muscle, which accounts for about 40% of your body. And when you're standing up like I am right now, you're actually activating a lot of skeletal muscles, and they're using glucose. If I start walking, they're going to use more glucose. If I start exercising, they're going to use even more glucose. So what happens with the development of insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes is that you have this increase in glucose, insulin goes up, but it can't get the glucose into the cells it's supposed to. So it stays elevated in your bloodstream. Okay, and the way the body responds to that is just to make more and more insulin. And that's what's called insulin resistance. The body's trying to make more insulin to compensate for the inability of the insulin to promote glucose going into the cells it's supposed to go into. And over time, the pancreas can't compensate anymore, and that's when you develop type 2 diabetes. Okay? Glucose gets in your muscle.
Make a room for you.
One is when the muscle contracts, it activates this little protein, these proteins called glucose translocators. And they're in the middle of the cell, and when your muscle contracts, they move to the edge of the cell and they facilitate glucose coming into the cell. So every time you walk or you move or you contract a muscle, you're activating those glucose vesicles that translocate to the cell membrane. The muscle's saying, I need energy. I'm going to set my biology up in a way where I get energy in, get glucose in. Second way it does it is that insulin activates a receptor and causes the signaling cascade, and that also makes glucose go to the cell membrane and helps glucose get into the cell. So you got two independent mechanisms. One without insulin that's driven by muscle contraction, and one that's driven by insulin. And the fascinating thing is those two things are related. They discovered, when they first discovered insulin, they realized that it took farmers a lot less insulin to help get their glucose under control than it did office workers. When they first discovered insulin and were treating type 1 diabetes, they realized there was some kind of physical work made people more insulin sensitive. Okay? And this is true in healthy individuals, and it's true in less healthy insulin resistant individuals, that contracting the muscle makes insulin have more of an effect. So the two things I want you to get away from this are, if you move more, you're going to have more glucose disposing effects, getting glucose into the muscle, because the muscle needs energy, and it needs glucose to make that energy. And then it's also going to make you more insulin sensitive. So if you consume a meal, insulin goes up, it's going to dispose of that glucose better. Now, what's the evidence that any of this matters? Well, the evidence is epidemiological data that clearly shows that at any, or that the number one cause of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes is a sedentary lifestyle, which means you spend a lot of time sitting and not moving. You have very limited physical activity, and you're not exercising. And when they look at the data across even different body weights, lean, overweight, obese, that really still shows through. Even if you're overweight and obese, if you move more, you are protected from type 2 diabetes. And then it's like a 30% protection based on how you look at things. And there's even really awesome physiological studies, and my lab has done some of these, where If you're not familiar with continuous glucose monitors, these are little probes that go under the skin. They've been around for about 10 years, and they can measure glucose on a minute-to-minute basis. And they use those now to help type 1 and type 2 diabetes patients control their glucose. We did a study where we had people wear those. They were getting 10,000 steps a day, and they wore them for 3 days. They were all very active exercising, getting lots of steps, getting lots of exercise. Their glycemia would go up and down with their meals. Then we asked them to come back and do 3 days where they got less than 5,000 steps a day, not exercise, and eat the exact same foods at the exact same times. Then they have these big glycemic surges, which means their glucose went up higher and lower throughout the day. Okay, so that's showing that it's not your body weight that regulates this glycemia, it's your activity. And there's been lots of other studies. Bed rest studies have been done, which are really there were studies to figure out what happens to astronauts. There's also been bed rest studies to figure out what happens with chronic inactivity in bed rest. One of your parents gets stuck in a bed for 5 days at the hospital, right? What happens? Their glycemia gets out of control because glucose stays in the cell. The muscle doesn't need the energy. It says, I don't need that glucose in my cell, and your glucose just stays elevated in circulation. Does that make sense? So, and then there's also been studies where, for example, we did a study where we just wanted to see what if we do short amounts of exercise over a small period of time in people with type 2 diabetes. So we did the exact same thing. We had continuous glucose monitors. We asked participants who were a little bit obese and had type 2 diabetes. We asked them to just have their glucose measured for 3 days in their normal condition, and then we asked them to come into the lab and do an hour of exercise for 7 straight days. In those last 2 days, that 7-day period, we measured glucose again, and glucose went down. And it doesn't go down to the level of a person without type 2 diabetes, but it's a huge effect. And it not only lowered the peaks, it also lowered the nadir. So they were in a more tight range. So there's, this epidemiological data over large cohorts. There's this physiological data measured on an individual basis in the laboratory, all really showing that if we could just get a little bit more physical activity in our life, it has a big effect on our glycemia and our risk for diabetes, independent of body weight. The last thing I'll say is that this insulin resistance phenomenon is really the kind of the core metabolic feature that causes a lot of cardiovascular disease, a lot of Alzheimer's disease, a lot of cancers. A bad culprit for a lot of diseases is insulin resistance phenotype. So even if you never get
just
type 2
let people
diabetes,
know what we're doing.
if you're insulin resistant and you have these higher glycemic swings and it takes more insulin to control your glucose, that independent of ever developing diabetes has been shown to be linked to cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and a whole bunch of other risk factors. So of course, none of these things are black and white, right? I mean, we're all trying to mitigate risk. I could be active my whole life and I could still have some kind of disease that I'm trying to tell you physical activity completely cures. It doesn't, but it's about mitigating your risk. And I think that's all. I'll stop there. Any questions? Yes.
That last point that you made, is there it's the same study or article that we did before
About insulin resistance as a
Yeah.
cause.
Yeah, like.
John, can you repeat the questions?
Yes, the question was, is there a great article or, review that really highlights insulin resistance as a core foundation of a lot of disease states?
Something we could send to family members who are concerned.
There is articles about physical activity and exercise being the core feature for all these different disease states. Yes, and I can try to find a good one. Yeah. Yes.
I have a handful of loved ones that are notorious for whenever they start feeling sick, they won't stop doing something. Where you're like, just go sit down, go lay down, and God, I can hear it, like, tell it, if I stop, I'm starting to feel worse. Is there anything related to glucose and like when you're not feeling well, like that activity helps?
That's a great question. I don't know. I do know that when you get an inflammatory disease or you have sepsis in the hospital, one of the things that helps protect you is you get hyperglycemic, your glucose goes way up, and that has some kind of positive role in helping you fight the inflammation and the infection. But I don't. That's a great question. I don't know.
Because it's like a stubborn battle, right? Don't really know.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Oh, I'll repeat the next question.
Yeah, no worries.
I'll say it loud over here. What's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? What makes them different? What makes them the same?
So type 1 diabetes is a condition where you have an autoimmune response that blocks your pancreas' ability to make insulin. So it's an autoimmune response. Some people develop it early in way early in life. Some people don't develop it until they're 18, 19, 20. That's type 1 diabetes. And so they can't make insulin. They almost 100% have to take insulin as a medication to keep the glucose down. It was a death sentence until we discovered insulin in the early 1900s. Type 2 diabetes is a disease where the pancreas makes tons of insulin, but the peripheral tissues become not responsive to it. And so you produce more insulin to compensate. And the genetic component of it is in the pancreas. Basically, the pancreas at some point says, I can't compensate anymore, and it kind of burns out its ability. It still makes a lot of insulin, but it can't make enough to compensate for the insulin resistance. And the sad thing about it is it used to be called adult onset diabetes. We had to get rid of that terminology in the 90s because now we have 14, 15, 16-year-old kids getting it right and left. So there's something going on in our environment that's really driving it to a younger age. There is a genetic susceptibility. Like my father had type 2 diabetes. If I stop moving, really consume a ton of calories, drink all the beer I wanted, I guarantee I would develop it in the next 10 to 20 years, develop it in his late 30s. But if I stay active and I stay on the insulin sensitive side of the paradigm and don't challenge my pancreas to have to hyperproduce a truckload of insulin, I should be protected, or at least I'm going to mitigate it until I'm maybe in my 70s or 80s.
Can someone with type 1 diabetes who receives insulin become type 2 diabetes?
Yeah.
Can they develop type 2 diabetes? Can they become insulin resistant?
So they become very insulin resistant. So type
Oh, it's
people
like
with- yes. So the question was, do people with type 1 become insulin resistant? And they do. They become very insulin resistant, and they require a lot of exercise to really help. The problem is it's really hard for type 1 diabetes patients to titrate their insulin dosages with their glycemia. And so it makes a lot of people not want to move or exercise because it's insulin sensitizing them. So like teenage athletes are notorious. They become hypoglycemic when they swim or they play sports. And then they have to really learn how to dose insulin differently on days they're exercising versus not. It's really complicated. But they're coming out with these closed loop systems that measure glucose with the CGM and dose insulin, and now they're adding accelerometers to that basically like use AI to learn how insulin sensitive they are when they move versus not move and dose insulin appropriately. But it is a major challenge. Yes.
Exactly for a nice talk. Our exercise tonight. I have a question. So this climate change in the glycemia and those level. Actually, the glucose supply to the brain is pretty stable. So I want to know how the exercise will help to reduce risk for Alzheimer's disease in that case.
That's a better question for a more neuro-related metabolic expert. But one of the things that happens when you develop neurodegenerative diseases is that glucose metabolism in the brain goes down. And we know that exercise helps glucose metabolism stay elevated in the brain. And you actually increase glucose metabolism in the brain when you exercise as well.
So is there any signal that enter the metabolite that's improving?
There's molecules that come out of the muscle, we call them myokines. There's molecules that come out of the liver, we call them hepatokines. There's all these signals that come out of tissues when you exercise. They go to other tissues and have positive effects. And there's a lot of studies suggesting there's different exercise-induced molecules that go and have a positive effects on the brain.
I inject into my brain so I can satisfy.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, sir. Yes. So the question was, what dietary habits play a role? Definitely, it's an interaction between a poor diet and inactivity that causes this increase in type 2 diabetes. So foods that are low are high in glycemic index. What that means is like white bread is the standard glycemic index food. That means as soon as you digest it, your glucose spikes. So anything with simple sugars are going to cause you to have more glucose elevations and really challenge the system. That's why whole grain, some people just say we should eliminate all carbs. It's not that simple. We've been fine with carbs for thousands of years, but complex grains are slower to degrade, and instant glucose is going to come up slower in circulation. So yeah, and then saturated fatty acids and high fat diets also cause problems with insulin resistance as well. Yes, Aaron.
Does anybody else you want to ask your question?
Yeah.
So what's better to walk? 5 minutes of movement once an hour for 12 hours, or an hour of movement once a day?
So that's a great question, and that's been a big argument in the field. And there's actually data that shows they're pretty much equivalent, especially for healthy individuals. Now, if you have type 2 diabetes and you have insulin resistance, there's really good evidence that you probably want to get that 30-45 minute bout, plus go for a 5 or 10 minute walk, like after every meal. It's kind of help that glucose come down. But there have been really neat studies where they have office workers just get up every 20 minutes and stand for 2 minutes and sit down or do light activities like this, and it really helps their glucose control. So I would do both if you can. And they call them exercise snacks.
So go for a walk after you eat.
Go for a walk after you eat. Yep, there's really good data on it.
In the main part of your talk, you were saying insulin resistance. Isn't you differentiating that with type 2 diabetes? It's not one of the same.
So it's the insulin resistance that occurs in type 1.
Oh, move it this way. Yes. Yeah.
The insulin resistance can really drive vascular disease and cause cardiovascular disease. So the insulin resistance that occurs in type 1 or type 2, it doesn't matter. They both kind of meet the same pathologies. Yeah.
How do you quantify exercise? That is a key part of the
Yeah.
Because the big difference between, say, 10 minutes deadlifts versus 3 hours of soccer.
Yeah, and it's really hard to compare those two things. So that's where you get into intensity matters. So for like, as I'm walking slowly to this door, I'm only going to recruit maybe 10 or 20% of the muscles in my legs. And I'm only going to drive that glucose metabolism effect in those muscles I recruit. When I deadlift a heavy weight, I'm going to recruit all of the muscles. And so I'm going to get more benefit from all of those muscles. That's why resistance training and being able to use all the muscles in my body is a really powerful tool to help with glycemia. At the same time, a lot of people aren't going to do that. But there is studies showing that you either want to have a higher volume of wide intensity, or you want to have a higher volume or a higher load of high intensity, and maybe it's much more shorter duration, but both are going to help your insulin sensitivity. It's a really good question, though. It's whatever you like. I just need to help people find what they like to do and push them in that direction. So.
I think we should move on. I want to thank you for that talk. And also, but before you go, I want to thank you by offering to spike your glycemic index by buying you with your Carlson.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for putting that along, and also thanks to Dr. Thyfault for a great talk. Before we introduce Dr. Carlson, I think Alma Mader wants to get a candid picture of everybody here. That's okay. Oh, 5 minutes? Okay.
I'll take that for you if you want.
Moving on to the next talk. Again, big thanks to Dr. Thyfault. Great talk, great question. Thank you for his time. Our next speaker is Dr. Jordan Carlson. He is the Director of Community Engaged Health Research Center for Children's Health, Healthy Lifestyle at Children's Mercy. And his research aims to better understand the influence of health impacts of physical activity, sedentary behavior, both young children and adults. Without further ado,
So I'm really happy to be here and happy to see everyone. So I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I've been in Kansas City for about 10 years. I'm in Children's Mercy Hospital. My background's in public health, so I don't know so much about cells or the basic parts of our body, but I know a little bit about the behaviors of physical activity and sedentary time and how to promote those behaviors, and a little bit about how we can be a little bit more creative about supporting increases in physical activity in our communities and our population. So I want to start out talking a little bit about the kind of how this physical activity issue that we're talking about here can be explained somewhat by the evolution that we've gone through as humans. So if we think about what were we doing, our ancestors doing tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago, they were quite physically active, not by choice. They weren't running marathons or going and doing what we would call exercise, but they were needing to be physically active to prepare their food, to hunt, to gather, to farm, and to get from place to place. So just being active in the way that you transport your bodies, with a big interest in mind. How do we support people to learn how to find ways to be where it's easier to engage in active transportation, engage in sources of physical activity, well, we're not always thinking about it being purposeful exercise, right? And so John talked a little bit about, and we had some great questions about this, do we need to go exercise for 30 minutes a day, an hour a day? Does it need to be a purposeful exercise where you go to the gym or where you have a big outing activity? Well, for weight loss, that's probably what we need to do without and higher intensity and even more exercise than the recommendations. But when we're just talking about the activities of daily living, generally we use physical activity guidelines. A really interesting thing about the U.S. physical activity guidelines is a few years ago, as John was alluding to, they removed the requirement to be active in long periods of time. Before, we used to say you need to get your activity in bouts of at least 10 minutes of exercise. Now we know that just any movement is good. So even just walking a little bit further to your car, walking instead of driving a short distance. One thing that I've been really interested in is how often do people use the stairs? Right, so just using the stairs in a few minutes of physical activity. And so I think that our bodies and our ancestors, they were so used to getting this physical activity that now we've made our life so much better and so much simpler that we've engineered a lot of the physical activity out of our lives. And so I think that's why we see a lot of the epidemics that we're seeing today of high rates of these preventable chronic diseases, low rates of physical activity, because we have all of these wonderful inventions in our lives. And so one big one is we transport differently now. And that's partly because of the invention of the car, which is a great invention, but it's also the way that we've designed our communities where we have to drive from place to place in many communities. There is nothing that's in walkable distance, or even bikeable distance in a lot of communities. And so those are just basic reasons why we're not as active as we used to be, just looking back 50, 100 years prior. And so I think transportation is one big way that we engineer physical activity out of our lifestyles. There's also a lot of other ways as well in technology. We don't have to work as hard to get things done. We can prepare our food. Food just comes straight to us. We go to the grocery store. We have everything we could possibly imagine right in front of us. It's so easy to go out and not have to really do any kind of movement. Sometimes we think about those things as physical labor, and breaks from labor is good, right? But sometimes it leads us to move much, much less. And so you could argue, like, yeah, cars are good, all of these inventions are good. I'm not arguing against those things, but what's happened is that people who want to do active transportation, people who want to basically incorporate movement into their lives more holistically, it's a lot harder for those people to do that. It's so much easier to just get in the car and drive somewhere. That's how we kind of get on. our communities. So one thing I look at with the evolution of music life too is not only what communities look like, but how other communities in other parts of the world look. They've evolved slightly differently than ours. So communities that were primarily built before the car was so centric to our culture, a lot of older communities, European communities, even really old cities in the US, they look quite a bit different. It's much more easier to get around. That's and so I'm not saying that we have to go back to that way, but what's happened is that in a lot of some of our newer ways of thinking about having some communities in the 60s and the decades since, we've really gone away from that. And now I think our society is starting to realize how much of an impact that's had on not only health, but very interesting, but so many of the ways that we design our communities, how it impacts activity, also impacts our environment too. And it's not just cars, it's a lot of this technology and as well. So kind of interesting to think about. One way I really like to simplify how do we design our communities to better support physical activity. You know, we can argue, about community designs and things like that. But one thing that I've never heard very many people argue about anyway is we think about how our buildings are designed. How many buildings have a stairway? Right? They all have a stairway. How many buildings can you find the stairway? How often do you go to a building and a beautiful stairway is greeting you when you walk in? And you know exactly how you're going to get to the next floor or after that. Now, usually the elevator greets you, right? When you walk in the building, the stairway is hidden behind a bunch of doors, way around that corner. You might have to go to the back of the building. It's a perfect example, and it's, you can find plenty of beautiful buildings that have done the stairways right. But on the old campus where I was in California before here, I went into every building. And only 2 of the buildings had beautiful stairways, right? All of the other ones are on the sides. They're more like fire exits and things like that. So very simple ways to try to re-engineer our communities, make it easier for people to be active. Oftentimes, without even thinking about it, not thinking about exercising, you're just getting more throughout the days of our lives. I'll talk a little bit about sedentary time that kind of complements some of what John was talking about. So a couple additional points and aspects about this kind of new evolving area of sitting is the new smoking or sitting is killing us. There's been a lot of media attention for the past maybe 10 years or so. And some of the really interesting things that have come out of this is that if you take 2 individuals who both have the same amount of physical activity, when we define physical activity, we define movement that's that meets a certain threshold of intensity, right? So we call 3 metabolic equivalents or 4 metabolic equivalents is once you start reading the what we call moderate intensity activity. You get a little bit higher in the 6, 7, 8 metabolic equivalents, you get into vigorous activity. So if you can do vigorous activity, sometimes you can get away with doing less of it. So if you have less time, you can go to 10 minutes of vigorous activity. With more time, you can go to 20 minutes of moderate activity. That's kind of how intensity is going to compare. Well, what we're learning is that with 2 individuals who get the same amount of moderate to vigorous physical activity, let's just say they each get the recommended 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity for adults. Yet one individual spends, so that's only like 30 minutes of your day. You have to spend the rest of your day. But one of those individuals spends the rest of their day moving around kind of slowly. They sit a little bit at their job, but they stand up every once in a while, like John was demonstrating. There's some standing breaks, and they have some light activity. So activity that involves movement but doesn't quite reach that threshold of moderate activity. That individual generally is much better off with their health, lower risk for diabetes, lower risk for cardiovascular disease. They both get 150 minutes per week of activity, but one spends much more time sitting. And it really comes down to sitting. And that's typically how we've been defining sedentary time. I'm standing right now, that's definitely better than sitting. The one thing, that I think is really interesting is Mary, I think, John, and maybe John can chime in on this too, but I think we're every year we're learning more and more about the impacts of sitting and exactly what is it about sitting. So John talked about muscle activation, glycemic control, and that is definitely behind it. What some of the very recent studies have tended to show or suggesting, if we need to look at it more though, is that it might not just be as simple as standing versus sitting. It might be that transition from the standing to sitting. So if I go from sitting 8 hours a day to sitting 6 hours a day and standing 2 hours a day, that's certainly going to benefit me. However, if I spread that standing out across those 8 hours of sitting where I'm getting up every 20 minutes or every 30 minutes, I'm activating those muscles going from that sitting position or that standing position. That seems to be key and almost even more important than the total amount of time someone spends standing. And so I measure the behaviors of physical activity. So we use a lot of sensors. We're trying to measure energy expenditure, intensity of physical activity. What I do most often is simply just measure how many steps people take. That tends to be the less predictor of health markers, health risks. It's just a very simple measure. So yeah, it's fun to measure your energy expenditure, your exercise intensity. But if you just measure your steps, you're doing really well. And that's going to be the best indicator. What we're doing in some of our research studies is actually measuring how much time someone spends sitting, and then how often they stand up and go back down. So they'll sit to stand transitions, to sit transitions. Those have historically been really hard to measure with sensors. If you wear like an Apple Watch, a Fitbit, those things, they do tell you every once in a while, hey, you need to stand up, but they don't really know that you're sitting. They just know that you're not really moving. So if you're at a standing desk, right? Well, that's kind of the new thing that people are excited about, a standing desk. Well, your Fitbit probably still thinks you're sitting when you're standing at your desk because you're not moving very much. So they're really just measuring movement. So what we have to do, we have to use sensors that go on other parts of the body. So we use a sensor that goes right on the front of your thigh. So it knows if you're sitting or you're standing, it knows your thigh's orientation to the ground, and it knows when your thigh position changes. So we can capture not only how many minutes or hours does each person spend standing, but how many times do they go up from that sit to stand transition. And it's those transitions that are potentially having some of the strongest associations with different health markers. Now, again, that's a very young science, but generally we know sedentary behavior is not good for us. And standing is good, but again, if I really those transitions, which I'll learn more about. And I think, the only other thing that I'll add just briefly is a little bit more about some of our sensor work. And so we use both kind of consumer grade monitors like Fitbits and Apple Watches. Something you might find interesting is that even though sometimes I will snark at the quality of some of those devices for our research, they are extremely useful tools for our health promotion programs, where people can actually look and see where they are, what their progress is that day, how many steps do they have at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock, how many steps do they have across the prior days of the week. And we work with them to set goals and then identify what are the obstacles you face in your environment. How can you reach your goals? And we use kind of those behavior change type tools. We work with a lot of psychologists, but then also people who really understand the environment and how to address those environmental impacts. It's really hard as a researcher to change the environment overnight. We do a lot of research on how to inform policies and community design, things like that. But to really help people now, we focus a lot on these wearables, these goals, physical activity goals, helping people meet those goals. And then for our research, then we tend to use the research-grade monitors where we can get a lot more detailed information, a lot richer data, and we're even working with computational scientists, engineering, computer science, to use raw signals from these data. And the hardware that's coming out in some of the sensors is outstanding. And we can do so many more things with that, with those hardware when we apply these more sophisticated computational approaches. It's an untapped area. And there's a lot of debate that feel like, should we just be giving everyone Apple Watches in our cohort studies to measure their behaviors? There's certainly a value for that, especially when we're doing interventions. Unfortunately, when we're doing research, it really limits the level of detail in the clinical studies. So there are lots of studies out there that are using Fitbits. Well, we don't know if those people who are wearing them, they're sitting or standing, or how often they engage in participants. We have someone measuring their sleep accurately. We don't know about their sleep safety. So we kind of come at that approach where we both kinds of monitors have their use and their appropriate application. But we get really excited about using some of the research monitors. We partner with computer scientists like here from Children's Mercy to apply these more sophisticated machine learning approaches, using this, trying to learn more about human behaviors from the raw data. So I think I'll end there. Questions.
Now we use the people like me, I know everyone needs to accept yourselves. Just wondering, we have some patients who is hard to be educated. Is the heavy exercise like help with the keyboard machine, help them? Yeah.
So can you give me an example of that?
Like for patients, one academic channel position, someone who is paralyzed. With the hard to change their position, and I'm wondering, I help them or machine help them.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so I think the question was just about, I think it's a combination of for people who may have disabilities or illnesses and can't engage in exercise that a typical general population can engage in. Are there still things that they can do to be active? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, for I think if you have limb issue, mobility problems, then there's definitely other kinds of exercise you can engage in. Oh, electrical stimulation. So I don't know very much about that. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, the top study showing that you can have people sit in a chair and use electrical stimulation to contract muscle and improve the glycemia through that. And then you talk about passive exercise, paralyzed people, it does have metabolic benefits as well.
Yeah, I don't, if you think about it at the population level, there's really a lack of research on how to promote physical activity in people with different disabilities. A lot of those studies have lumped people with all kinds of different disabilities, but really, it takes a personalized approach. So I think that's kind of young, the physical activity recommendations too are based on the general population. So we don't have specific physical activity recommendations for people with different disabilities. So those are important.
One question I have is, we're talking about the buildings and analyzing the they're located. I think a lot of space on vehicles. For me, as a part of enthusiast, when we drive the luxury car, and I'm a cyclist, and as a part of vehicles are increasingly becoming taller, easier to slide in and out of, rather than having to make a squat mode.
Oh, that's interesting. So physical activity getting in and out of a car.
Yeah, in particular, like a good example is Subaru Razor versus the Crosstrek. You raise that hatchback, it's the same car, same chassis, but that Crosstrek is had a bigger suspension to carry more weight, human or not, and it's lifted so that it's easier to in and out. Are you essentially at odds with R&D
I'm definitely not at odds. I think the question is about, is the way that we design our cars. If they're easier to get in and out of, does that impact physical activity? It's probably a very small role. You know, how many times a day you get in and out of your car? You know, it's probably a couple of times or something now. Now maybe for a very select few individuals, that might matter. Well, where I thought you were going with car design was more about, thinking about how car design impacts pedestrian safety and things like that, where, you know, the bigger our cars got, the more dangerous they got, right? So it's become, it was a lot safer to be outside walking or running in the streets if you were a kid or even an adult 2 decades ago, right? And the bigger our cars got, the faster our speeds got, the more dangerous it is to be active out in your neighborhood in front of your house.
I guess my main thing is to talk about mobility going upwards with a lot. And as someone who's lived in Party City, squatting is very uncommon in the United States. It's a great movement. And that may be the only time somebody actually does squat.
Yep. That's interesting, yeah. Yeah, so I think the hypothesis is that the lower cars can result in greater kind of activation of those muscles because you're going from a lower position. So like interesting research. Cool. Yes, any question about that? So as far as the physical activity guidelines go, the recommendations are the same for men and women. It's 150 minutes per week for adults, which is about 30 minutes, 5 days a week on average. And for kids, it's 60 minutes a day, 1 day a week. That's the same for boys and girls. I think probably one reason it's the same is because there's probably a lack of good research on sex differences, because we know biology is different, and it would be very fair to expect that there's different requirements or needs for men and women. So that the lack of specific recommendations for men and women is probably due to a lack of sufficient research. And so I'm trying to think of other places there's sex differences. You want to comment on that, biology?
Definitely post-menopause, there's a lot of evidence that women become less active. And I think in 20 years, our guideline will say that women may need more activity post-menopause than men of a similar age to maintain the same metabolic health, because the loss of ovarian function is just so powerful on our metabolism, on women's metabolism. That's what I would predict. And the animal data is exactly the same. So we do studies where we over-optimize mice, and we take the ovaries out, and they become very inactive in their cages. They don't want to run. They gain weight much easier. And it's pretty much what we see in the clinical human studies too with women. So that would be my.
One other place I'll comment on like sex differences is for as far as looking at what proportion of the population meets physical activity guidelines, it tends to be higher for men and higher for boys. So especially when we look at kids, boys tend to be much more likely to physical activity guidelines than girls. I don't think the difference is quite as big when we're looking at adults. And I think as we get into middle-aged, older adults, I think it even flips a little bit, if I remember right, which is kind of interesting, right? But yeah, in the younger ages, the girls tend to be less active. I don't think there's a clear consensus on is that biological, is it cultural, is it both? But there's lots to think about. Explain.
I was wondering if you see, coming from here, what do you see as the biggest roadblocks to behavior change And maybe on the flip side of that, for this kind of audience is, have you found that monitors and apps like that are effective getting people into more activity as they go along? And also, in that respect, is there a benefit to the reward type system?
Okay, good, that was great.
Can you
I think
repeat
three
each?
questions,
Yeah.
I'll try to repeat them. The first one was about, barriers in the community. And the second one was about apps, the benefit of apps and for promoting physical activity. And then the third one was about rewards. The first one, I'll talk a little bit about some of the communities that we work in here in Kansas City. We tend to work a lot in lower income communities, communities that have a lot of racial ethnic diversity. And a lot of what we hear that's consistent with other communities across the country and other research as well, is that there tends to be a lack of, I think, knowledge and education. So people generally know that physical activity is good for you, but they don't always really know exactly how much they need, what qualifies as physical activity, and also, how to be more active. And then some of the other, I'm just losing my train of thought here a little bit, but they also, I think, don't have some of the skills. They clearly, there's a community there. So a little bit of it's education and knowledge of how to be more physically active, and some of it is how to mitigate some of the community barriers, environmental barriers. Sometimes people think you have to have a lot of financial resources to be physically active, and for certain types of physical activity, that's absolutely true. So sometimes it's a matter of helping find other opportunities in the community for physical activity that are free or low cost. Helping people think more about physical activity as just kind of a lifestyle, day-to-day movements that they incorporate throughout their day. Trying to help them address things like time barriers, parenting obligations, a lot of stress, and time to stress reduction and health. So those are some, I think, ways to.
Oh, we're
promote
really good.
physical activity.
I'm not worried.
When people are immediate, when you can't change, entire communities, or you can't get, say, a park or a new recreation center built, but right away, like advocate for those things, you can support individual community members in some of these ways. The mobile health apps and things, I think those are really promising. So one huge advantage is that they improve access. So, and a lot of people don't have access or have limited access to care. And it's really a matter of access to the knowledge and the information and the education, things that I was just talking about, are lower in lower income communities, but they're just low system-wide generally. And historically, when we've done health promotion programs, it's required, I would say, at least amount of what I would call burden, even though people want to participate, they want to do it, there's burden in that. It has to occur at the right time, the right schedule, they have to show up. Oftentimes you have to get a group of people there at the same time. There's all kinds of scheduling challenges. People are very busy and we just get busier and busier. So there's a lot of barriers to in-person type intervention. There's a lot of pros and advantages to them. But the barriers is that they have low reach, and you can only reach a limited amount of people. So these apps allow people who are delivering these health promotion intervention, psychologists and other health promotion researchers and practitioners to deliver their health promotion programs in a way that reaches a lot more people. Some of the drawbacks are that sometimes people maybe really sign up for those and really want to engage, and then they lose interest. It's not that exciting, So there's a lot of research on how do we create these apps and mobile health approaches in a way that keeps people engaged and that are exciting that people want to engage in. They don't feel phony, they still feel personalized, they still feel like they're getting the attention maybe of a human, or they're getting personalized attention like we would get from a human. So a lot of, I think that there's clear research that the apps are a big solution to scalable health promotion programs, improving reach, and the really exciting research is how do we design these programs to maximize their use and their engagement. And so you asked about rewards. That's definitely, been looked at. Some research has even paid people to be physically active, but how do you sustain that, right? And so there's theories of motivation and looking at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. If you reward someone and you pay them, you probably can't do that forever. And so you're kind of building maybe an extrinsic motivation, and when that goes away, they no longer are as motivated. But if you can find what is intrinsically motivates them, what is it that, why do they want to be more active, increase their daily step counts or whatever? What is the intrinsic driver of how physical activity aligns with their core values and things like that? Those types of reinforcers seem to be the strongest, as opposed to more external reinforcers. But we usually use a combination of both. We use a lot of like reinforcement, encouragement, breaking down your goals, and appraising whether you've met those goals, and if not, how to get there. And then the other thing I'll say is that you asked how apps can be more effective. So in addition to the engagement part, making them fun and exciting, I think the researchers would say that those apps need to be based on like theory-based and evidence-based principles, right? So we kind of use rewards or reinforcement. There's a whole theories of motivation, of goal setting, of problem solving, of communication. And maybe you're talking about parent-child communication if you're supporting children to be more active. And so the research tends to show that when these apps and programs like that are designed with careful consideration of these theoretical frameworks, or really just sound evidence-based techniques that have been tried and proven, that when those are integrated into the apps, then they're much more successful.
Sounds like there's lots of strategies we should be employing, including apps and technology, and I definitely want rewards. I think everybody needs to reward themselves, particularly our speakers, with some more drinks. Thank you to the government. A lot of that exercise, and we've all been sitting here and having our thoughts.
So thank you, everyone. There is a small bit of merch if you want it below where the plates are. Visitors Cares has been doing this for years, so if you want to watch it again for some reason, they post it on YouTube. They're recording multiple times, so feel free to do that. We'll start breaking things down, but please enjoy some time hanging out outside. Thank you, John and Jordan. I feel like we need to go for a walk out.
So the way oh yeah. Yeah. What are your guys' thoughts on? We need a bigger meeting. Yes. We know.
I'm gonna totally say a thank you, and we'll get a bigger venue next time. Like that'll go out on social media. The venue will be bigger. Yeah. I'm